Welcome to Catastrophes. This is a podcast about disasters, why disasters happen, and the factors that make them happen and that contribute to them. My name is Brady Pulowski, and I am your host. And today we are discussing the Indonesian floods and landslides that have occurred since mid-November up until about the first week of December. Today we're going to be exploring the different elements to how this event has unfolded, really looking at the vulnerabilities or kind of the underlying conditions that have made this disaster quite extreme in how it has unfolded. We're going to be discussing climate change, some of the factors that have driven the floods and the landslides. We're also going to be talking about the human-induced side of things, where we know illegal logging, development, and some other factors have really contributed to a lot of the damages of how widespread this event has been. So, with that, the intent of exploring today's event is not to demean or diminish the experiences of people who have faced this significant widespread disaster, but rather to explore, question, critique, and ask why this event has been so bad, and why it has unfolded the way it has. So with that, let's begin. Welcome. Today we're discussing the Indonesian, the West Sumatra, North Sumatra, and Aceh floods and landslides, and we're going to cover kind of a comprehensive overview of everything we know as of December 23rd, 2025, and all of the recent updates, including the decision to not make this a national disaster, which has significant implications, basically the framing of this disaster for Indonesia as a whole. We're going to talk geography, how that really has played a role, and then overall impacts and illegal logging, climate change, all sorts of different factors, and why this disaster is just so profound and maybe a milestone is how we go about, or how the changes in how the government will hold those accountable for a lot of the illegal logging and deforestation that has occurred may have some implications for how future disasters are managed and responded to, and how the recovery goes as well. So, a milestone event, and I wanted to do justice to this topic and let some information come out before providing an overview and an analysis of how and why this disaster has unfolded the way it has. So with that, today we are going to cover a few different sides of it. We're going to do a quick impact on how it has unfolded, the widespread nature of it. We're going to look at the background of Aceh, North Sumatra, and West Sumatra, the different provinces of the island of Sumatra. And then we're going to look at the effects of landslides and the overall floods themselves, and kind of talk about how those two combined, landslides plus floods plus a bunch of the debris that has really rolled around, has created and kind of made the impact a bit worse than like a typical normal flood, I guess you could say. Next, we're going to look at climate change. We will then look at some of the existing vulnerabilities related with the people, the cities, the development of the cities. Then we will look at the element of illegal logging and the takeaway I get from that, and I guess I'll spoil it right now, but really we see a lot of no natural disasters ideas really come from the illegal logging, and how that logging has driven a lot of the widespread damage. We'll get into that and spend quite a bit of time on that. Finally, we will end off with the decision or the overall government's response. And that not only includes how they've responded with like the resources of the people, but also how they're framing it. The decision to not recognize this as a national disaster, while might not seem like a large and important issue in sense of like how we frame things, it's just that we respond to it, right? But the declaration to make this a Indonesian national disaster actually has profound implications for the resources that are available, the funding that is available, and also just for the people to know that their government is behind them. And there is already a protest. Again, not to spoil too much, we'll get into it. Finally, we will end off with some implications for wildlife. We're actually going to cover the orangutan because I found a few interesting articles and some information on that. And then we will close up just with a quick recap and summary of everything that we've explored. So, Indonesia, the island chain nation that is in the southern hemisphere. It is north of Australia, southeast of Thailand and Malaysia. Well, Malaysia south. And there is a lot of different cultures, different peoples, different religious denominations and affiliations throughout the island chain. And so this is me basically saying that the culture and the religion and the peoples themselves are quite different island to island. It's really not a monograph, or it's really not like the same kinds of people, I guess you could say, throughout the different kinds of islands. So in the East Indonesia, we have the Papua region, Papua New Guinea, and the island of Papua has far different basically cultural and religious affiliations than Sumatra does. So Sumatra is on the far west, and the island is made up of many different kinds of peoples and a lot of different geography as well. The island also, obviously, you got to mention the volcanoes. There are some active volcanoes, but majority of them are actually dormant. And with that, in Sumatra as well, there is a number of different provinces. So, a lot of different provinces. We're only going to be talking about 3 of them today. And the 3 that we're talking about are Aceh. And Aceh might be familiar to people who know about the 2004 Boxing Day in Indian Ocean tsunami, where one of the most destructive and deadly disasters of the last 100 years, with over 200,000 fatalities, many different injuries, and a seismic shift in how we manage disasters around the world. 21 years almost to that event. And Aceh is the same region where that saw the significant impact. So Aceh, again, being affected in these floods and landslides. Then we also have to look at West and Northern Sumatra. So they're both provinces, and West Sumatra is kind of in the middle of the island on the west side, and then North Sumatra is just a little bit south of Aceh. So hopefully you got a good sense of the islands, like provinces itself. Honestly, just going on Google Maps, there's no visual component to this one. This is purely audio, largely because I am not at home traveling, so I don't actually have my full tech bag, I guess you could say, to talk about all these things and provide pictures. There's a lot of photos I've provided and a lot of video evidence on my TikTok and Instagram page if you are interested in seeing more of that. And I tried to break down a lot of what we know in those videos in sometimes 1 to 2 minute video format. So if you're interested in that, please give me a follow and take a look at those videos if you can. So with that, getting into the impact. November, December, basically the summertime months there are really their monsoon season. So in Indonesia, monsoons will basically see 1 to 2 feet of water throughout a lot of the provinces and places. And so an abundance of water is not out of the norm. What is out of the norm, though, is when it's not 1 to 2 feet, it's 10 to 12 to 15 feet. And that's kind of what happened throughout Sumatra. Ever since November 17th, there has been significantly heavier rainfalls. And the rainfall has really started to intensify from November 17th up until November 25th. And then there's a caveat with November 25th. We'll get there in a minute. But realistically, again, just trying to kind of frame the amount of rainfall is unseasonably large amount. more than you would typically see in the regular season. And we have to really recognize that there is a natural cycle to monsoon seasons. There's a reason the ecosystems and the patterns of rainfalls occur in these places the way they do. 1 to 2 feet is normal, but we're seeing excessive amounts of rainfall in shorter amount of times. And that's really one of the tricks, or the keys here, is since November 17th up until about December 2nd, I'll say, we see an intense amount of rainfall over the course of 2 weeks. For reference, some areas, one example, northern Sumatra, one of the 3 provinces, saw 300 millimeters of rainfall in a single day. But the difficulty is it's not just one single day of rainfall, it's 2 weeks. So, 17th to the 25th, we see intense rainfall. It could be that 300 millimeters. I really had a hard time finding specific days of rainfall. I guess you could just say there's been some reports suggest that some areas received 1,000 millimeters within 4 days. So I think we can all come to the conclusion that there's an intense amount of rainfall, out of the norm, more than what this ecosystem is used to and can handle. But on November 25th, something unusual happens, and there is a significant climate change element that we will talk about between Sumatra and another basically island island province region just to the northeast of Sumatra. There's a strait of water, and it's called the Malacca Strait, and it has very significant historical importance. We won't get into that. But in this strait, there is no cyclones or typhoons or tropical cyclones that actually form. But on November 25th, for basically one of the milestones, and I guess you can talk about climate history, we see a cyclone start to form there. And it isn't necessarily like a Category 5 or Category 4, really intense or a big one, but 80-kilometer winds. So if we were to put it on the Saffir-Simpson scale, which is used in North America, it might be like a Category 1 hurricane equivalent. The difficulty with this tropical cyclone forming, and it was called Senyar, Senyar, if you want to Google it, is that it's the first time in, I'm going to say, our recorded history that a cyclone has formed over the Malacca Strait, or over this rain, or over this body of water that just does not see cyclones or large storms form. The problem was that as it formulated and as it basically intensified, it furthered the amount of rainfall that hit Sumatra, hit Aceh, North Sumatra, West Sumatra. Not only was there the 80-kilometer winds per hour, but the intense amount of moisture, humidity, and just rainfall really triggered widespread floods. And so with those widespread floods, early on the 17th to the 25th, I'll say, there's a lot of flooding, but that really pushed a lot of the debris, and it moved trees, it uprooted trees, and with that, a lot of the region is very mountainous. So one of the key kind of geographical elements of Sumatra is just how elevated, high to low it is. In the middle of it is basically a mountain range, or it's very mountainous, and then towards the sides of it is like low ocean, sometimes low-lying land. So mudslides and landslides occur and can occur because of the elevation difference. When you see rainfall in the middle of the island, the rain has to go somewhere. Well, so it's going to go down, and then it's also going to go into the natural ecosystems like we talked about. But the excessive amount also has the potential to drag mud, to drag debris, that is, trees that are uprooted and everything, and cause landslides. So floods were destructive, but landslides were really, really tricky and have caused a lot of different secondary issues. When we talk about overall impacts, so 17th of November to December 2nd, we have a significant amount of rainfall. We have a lot of different landslides as well. As of December 19th, there is 1,068 people who have been found dead. 7,600 people are injured, and over 158,000 houses have been destroyed or more than partially damaged. According to the Disaster Management Agency of Indonesia and of Sumatra, the island itself, there is over 12,000 buildings / items, that includes electricity, of public infrastructure that has been damaged across these three territories, or these three provinces is what I'm going to call them. And as of now, there are still 190 people who are missing. So what we know is that the landslides have actually caused the secondary issue of roads, and again, the public infrastructure, being really damaged. So there are reports in North Sumatra and West Sumatra that entire roadways and bridges are gone. One, because the amount of high level of water and it reaching the bridges, collapsing them. You can see a few of those videos on my TikTok and Instagram if you want to see them. And then also the landslides covering up roadways. There was a report early on in December that because roadways and bridges were gone or covered, some cities were isolated completely. There was no relief coming. There was no electricity. There was completely self-sufficient. They were completely isolated. There was no means of getting any sort of relief in and out. And those are two cities we know about. But I would also challenge the viewer, you, to think about, there's probably a lot of villages that might be more remote or might have a single lane or a single road in and out. A lot of them may still be isolated as of today. There was another report, and I want to say this is from the United Nations disaster management. They have a few different groups, and I'm blanking on their title. But one of the reports I found from them is that 3 weeks after the disaster, so I'm going to say about the 20th, maybe the 19th, at least 80 villages in Aceh and 8 villages in North Sumatra were isolated. So we don't know the size of those villages, but they're still isolated, and it kind of contributes to this. Well, there's 2 large cities in West Sumatra that were completely isolated. And again, landslides have that difficulty of managing them, and also in the immediate recovery, that relief phase, becomes really difficult to move logistics and move supplies to and from, especially with how Sumatra is located, Sumatra being an island. So the supplies they don't have there, they have to ship, or they have to basically get a large boat and move them, fly them up these high elevation areas. So the landslides are a really difficult hazard because they delay relief, they delay the logistics, they isolate communities and villages. That's what we're dealing with. And then the floods as well are catastrophic in the way that a lot of floods bring mud. So even if you are living in a city and you live on like maybe the 3rd or 4th floor, a lot of the roadways are going to be damaged, or a lot of the buildings, the infrastructure is going to be widespread and destroyed. And then there are still, as of the 19th of December, large power outages throughout the 3 regions, and it's been noted that aid has not been effectively distributed, particularly to the remote communities. Additionally, there is limited access to clean, fresh water. So many have had few rations, not enough water, but also it is still the monsoon season. And so some of the temperatures can be really harsh depending on the region and the amount of rain. So there is an urgent need for blankets, mattresses, clothes, and then basically things to keep people sheltered and covered. So overall, recapping the impacts, the widespread nature of this event and why it's just such a milestone event. 1,068 people found dead, 7,600 still injured, 158,000 homes damaged or destroyed, and the number of internally displaced peoples or displaced is going to be different than the number affected. And that's a question I've had before, is what's the difference between them? The internally displaced numbers is typically, sometimes when I read it, I don't think it's particularly clear to the person who's writing it, but typically we're supposed to see IDP, internally displaced numbers, be they don't have a home to go back to, or their home is destroyed, or it's not accessible. So as of the 17th, the Emergency Management Agency noted that there's 588,000 people who are internally displaced. The numbers range from 1 million to 3 million for affected by this event. So let's say your home is still intact, but you can't go work, or your family in another community is affected, you would be considered affected. And so there's 1 to 3 million people affected. Other interesting information, specifically from Aceh region, is the health sector. So since the 17th, Aceh has recorded 100 babies, 394 infants, 104 pregnant women, 459 elderly, and 7,524 people with disabilities who need additional support. However, Aceh has seen a limited access to a lot of relief. There is a need for medicine, there's a need for immediate relief, and again, as I've noted, there's been limited access to a lot of this relief. Schools are closed, jobs are obviously not, nobody is working, and there's also been a few holds on the major economic outputs for these regions. We're going to get into that in a bit. But the most profound impact for Aceh specifically is that there's no clean drinking water. There's no functioning water as of the 17th. So it might have changed within the last week, but as of now, there is a lot of delays, a lot of impact, I guess you could say. So that is impact, the damages. Quickly just touching on the geography of the three regions again, Aceh, West Sumatra, North Sumatra. They are mountainous regions. Some of them have several volcanoes. Some of them are active with recent eruptions, but many of them are dormant. So a lot of the land is high to low, meaning there's really high peaks and then there's really low lands. And that is one of the elements that makes landslides really destructive and possible. But landslides don't happen unless sometimes there's a catalyst, and maybe it's too much rainfall, maybe it's just loose ground, loose gravel, but there is a component of how Sumatra has really developed over the last 100 years. And if I could oversimplify it to not go too deep in, hours of development talk, but what we've seen is a lot of the remote villages throughout Sumatra and in other islands coming to Sumatra for to live and to seek livelihood. There has been a expansion of roadways, of natural ecosystems being removed in order to develop over them. And one of the common things we see, especially for the growing towns in Aceh, West Sumatra, North Sumatra, is the amount of new roadways built, but also the amount of sprawling cities to accommodate more people coming over. And I think one of the statistics that kind of best serves this is that we're seeing urbanization, or people coming from the rural places to urban centers because there's more employment, sometimes better livelihood, more access to resources and such. We're seeing that really take place in Sumatra as an island as a whole. And as a result, a lot of the growing economic cities, well, there's more roads, there needs to be more power lines, there needs to be more markets, there needs to be more human infrastructure. And what that does is it has reduced the pathways for floodwaters to go. And I actually found a few interesting components on a lot of the rivers in West Sumatra. And this report basically said they're not suitable for any sort of boats. So they are shallow rivers that run quick. And a lot of them sometimes are disrupted or displaced or halted with development. The secondary element of all of this, and something we're going to get into, I think now, is deforestation and the overall loss of wetlands and ecosystems. And quickly, as a tangent, I've seen a lot of climate adaptation, people talking about climate adaptation and saying that, well, if we just regrow or we just plant trees, we can fix, the climate, or we can fix the ecosystem. And I think that's kind of misleading. When we replant a tree, we absolutely regain the ability to capture carbon and, reduce the overall carbon that is entering the atmosphere and contributing to human-induced climate change. But planting more trees, hopefully the same tree or the same native species to that forest that you're planting it, and you're not, causing a secondary disaster with an invasive trees and other shrubs. Hopefully you're planting the same trees. But there's two different components, and one that we've particularly learned in Edmonton, Alberta, that if you plant, one, quote-unquote, male trees, you'll actually see an increase in pollen. And for Edmonton, there's been an increase in respiratory and allergies. So basically, land use planners and people have basically said, oh, well, if we plant the big tree, quote unquote, the male tree, it's going to provide more shade. We're going to be good. And then we're also helping, the quote unquote battle against climate change. The difficulty is that we can't actually replace ecosystems. And that is the critical component to all of this. So, one, just a quick takeaway. Planting trees is not saving ecosystems. And that is something we need to be thoughtful and considerate of. That we will remove entire ecosystems because we remove a swath of forests, and many of the diverse animals, wildlife that live there are now displaced. They have to seek shelter, livelihood elsewhere. Not livelihood. They have to seek shelter and move elsewhere. So even if we are replanting and, not deforesting at a significant rate, we're still contributing to a little bit of a shift in the ecosystems. And that has long-term implications. Not getting into that today. A possible tease for somebody coming on to the podcast maybe in February, March. So, with that, back to Indonesia, back to Sumatra. Deforestation has played a significant role in a lot of the lives. First, it is a huge economic boom in the sense of there's a lot of vast amounts of timber and trees and forests, Amazon-like forests and whatnot. The word is escaping me. The tropical forests is what I'm calling them for now. There's been a significant amount of deforestation. And with that, also the loss of wetlands. And a lot of that has really reduced the land's ability to absorb water. Particularly interesting is that a lot of the deforestation has occurred on the sides of hillsides. And when that happens, we see significant increases to the risk of landslides and the risk of downstream floods, because that land, that ecosystem is no longer holding more rain. It's no longer absorbing the water. So let's get into it. Illegal logging. And one of the key reasons why I think this event is so much worse than, one, the media portrays it. One, because we just don't see enough of it, or where the media coverage is sometimes just not in depth enough. It doesn't show, and sometimes there's just not access to it. But illegal logging, I would say, is one of the most important reasons why this has happened the way it has. So, kind of starting at the end of the illegal logging tangent. The government of Indonesia, the national government, has actually said the environmental ministry and the justice ministry have actually halted any operations for deforesting or for timber or for logging. which is significant because that is a huge economic component to all of this. That is a lot of what the national government makes the GDP from, is timber logging. So they've already halted that, and it's been halted for 3 weeks. More so, these companies are now being accused of illegal logging, that they've overlogged a lot of the areas, and now the Ministry of Justice has said, you are going to answer for the illegal logging that you have done, and you're going to basically go through the courts and tell us how much have you logged, and how many hundreds of thousands of acres have basically been taken down. So some reports, and so as of December 10th, the Ministry of Justice is now not only revoking 22 forest use permits, which are covering 1 million hectares of land that has forest cover, they're also bringing in several companies, and they might be eight companies, and they're looking to charge them, or they're looking to investigate basically how much illegal logging have they done, and then perhaps even give them maybe not jail time, but huge fines. And so this has a really important, I think, long-term implication that I want to spend a minute on. How this justice component, or this environmental justice component, is dealt with for Indonesia, I think has significant implications for other disasters around the world when it comes to deforestation and illegal logging. 8 companies are being held by the Ministry of Justice, and they now have to come into court, and they now have to explain how much forest did they actually deforest, I guess is the word, or log. And now they're being held to basically some accountability. The difficulty is number one, we don't know obviously what's going to happen with that, but some environmental groups say that, well, a lot of the government's actions are actually partly to blame. One, because they have gave the approval to log areas that are hugely important to the ecological health of the Sumatra island. But then also, sometimes the element of, I gave a company I knew this permit to do more logging, and they're going to provide some kickbacks or some funds to me for my next election. Things like that, the corruption element. But what we know is that 8 companies specifically, and I couldn't really find information about those 8, are being held accountable. So that's a really great component. Let's just now take it back to the beginning, now that we have the end in sight. What we know is that the illegal logging, and that over the last 20 years, there's been 631 companies who have been granted extractive licenses to deforest areas in North Sumatra, West Sumatra, and Aceh. And the amount of deforestation is not clear at all. What we can assume is that it is widespread, because there is already accounts, photos, investigations ongoing that deforestation was really a key driver of why these floods and landslides were so bad. Going back to the impact, we already talked about the amount of rainfall. But what was interesting, and something you can see in some of the videos that I've posted, is a lot of the massive rainfall and the massive flash floods had huge logs and timber in them. So much so that some of it covered the entire rivers and covered entire swaths of floods. And a lot of those logs, which are powerful when they are going downhill and they are going fast, they destroyed entire villages and destroyed entire infrastructure. So illegal logging really was a catalyst for why these floods and landslides were so significant and widespread. Logs were carried down the sides of hills and mountains in landslides, and they were carried with the floodwaters. destroying entire villages, isolating entire villages, and they obviously destroyed homes, infrastructure, and were swept along with the floods and the landslides. And I can't really emphasize just how important this is. This is cataclysmic in the sense of we illegal logging, people, human activity, human mismanagement was a core component of why the Indonesian Sumatra floods and landslides occurred. Corporations basically drove over extraction and cut giant swaths of land, and that land was not able to hold any sort of ecosystem and not hold any sort of water. So that is illegal logging, and not well formatted, I guess you could say. Poor podcasting on my part. But just to recap, we note that over the last 20 years, there's been excessive illegal logging and over extraction of timber throughout West Sumatra, North Sumatra, and Aceh. And there's been up to 631 companies who are participating in this over the last 20 years. Hundreds of thousands of hectares or more has been completely destroyed or logged to the point where the ecosystem is completely changed. And now the Ministry of Justice is going like, wow, these floods are so bad. And it sounds like people are investigating and talking. I think we have to hold them accountable. Now there's 8 companies being brought in for investigation, and we will see what happens. But I think the long-term implication is an environmental justice component that, depending on how that plays out, that could have profound implications for how other disasters around the world are managed. That if these companies are held accountable for their part in deforesting and going over what their permitted allowance was, if the permits had that kind of question, how much was actually allowed by the government, which is another separate / corruption problem. That has profound implications for how disasters should be talked about. Human mismanagement is a large driver of why effects are so widespread for many disasters. And I think, again, just can't gloss over it. And it's probably why I've spent way too long on illegal logging. But I think it's the catalyst for all of this. And why the damage was just so widespread. Why villages are not accessible. Why aid is not able to get anywhere. That is illegal logging. So now, the climate change element to all of this. And there's certainly a climate change element. And a human-induced climate change where by us changing the natural systems that have occurred. So again, it's normal to have 1 to 2 feet of monsoon water rainfall throughout these regions. When we get to 10 to 12 to 14 feet, it's not necessarily normal. And so Cyclone Senyar, occurring on November 25th in the Malacca Strait, is unheard of. One, because cyclones don't typically form on the equator, which is where this area is. But then the intensification of it occurring in that place is not something we often see. So what we know about our oceans, and this is the climate change component, is our oceans are warming. And the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, or IPCC, suggests that warming oceans, warming bodies of water, have the capability. They don't always produce, it's not 1-to-1, but they have the potential to produce storms, cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons, that can be more intense. But what does more intense mean? Typically, it comes down to, I think, one of 3 things. Is it the increase in frequency? So are storms going to occur more? Not necessarily. That's not necessarily what the science says. It doesn't fully support it yet. But what the current oceanography, I guess you could say, the climate change science says, is storms are starting to move slower, but also storms are starting to hold more moisture in the clouds and just the overall rainfall they can potentially dump, because oceans are warmer and evaporation can occur at a faster rate. What does that mean? Well, when evaporation happens at a faster rate, you see more clouds, more potential for rainfall. Kind of, that is 1-to-1. That is the clear implication. And there is medium to high confidence from the IPCC that is happening. What we're seeing, the severity in terms of the amount of rainfall is increasing. And this is where we see it. And I think this event is the perfect implication of this. Cyclone Senyar, which cyclones don't happen there. They don't form there. And if they do, they might pass over, but they don't form in the Malacca Straits. Because the oceans and some bodies of water are increasing in temperature, we're seeing part of our weather systems become weirder, I guess is the word. And I think Dr. Catherine Hayhoe says it best. Climate change is basically like a climate weirding, where we're just not sure of what's actually going to happen in terms of some of the weather patterns and systems. And I think this is kind of the perfect implication of that. So another analysis by the World Weather Attribution, which is made up of climate scientists, found that the intensity of the 5-day, so I believe they were talking about November 22nd to November 27th. The dates aren't particularly clear, but remember, November 17th to December 2nd is really where we see the intense rainfall. What this report says is that the intensity of 5-day episodes of heavy rains within Sumatra increased by 28 to 168% in the regions affected by Cyclone Senyar. And we can really attribute a lot of that to human-induced climate change. And I think this is kind of the space to really talk about the No Natural Disasters campaign. And if you've heard me talk about it, then you might be familiar with what I'm about to say. But a lot of disasters are attributed to, or caused by, or made worse by human decisions, human management of resources, whether that's timber or logging, or whether that's fresh water, or whether that's the carbon emissions, the transportation of people and pollution. All of this and the climate change element and the illegal logging really speak to we are the makers of most disasters. And that they aren't natural in the sense of the effects are driven by a lot of what we do and how we manage them. And I think by using terms like natural disaster, it really takes out the onus of who's responsible for this event. And I mean, we can point to specifically several companies who are more responsible for producing these impacts. So when we say, oh, well, the Sumatra floods are a natural disaster, that kind of shifts the blame away from 8 logging companies, perhaps it should be more than 8, to, oh, well, it was quote unquote Mother Nature. Whereas Mother Nature has always produced 1 to 2 feet of water in this region. But not only have we influenced the climate through our own means and through development, and through even developing our cities and urban sprawl, changing the systems in which rivers can run and water can flow, but deforesting hillsides so landslides can occur, and then more rainfall happening is kind of the element that we have produced a lot of these causes and problems ourselves. And then what ends up happening is people who have limited resources, or who might have to work a job where they are more vulnerable to the impacts of these disasters, they are more at risk, even though they might not be the greatest contributors to human-induced climate change or to deforestation. They're the victims of a lot of these disasters. So I like to refrain from saying natural disasters because I don't believe in them, because I think that there's oftentimes a core decision, a mismanagement of something that really pushes a disaster onto people who have no ability to really influence any sort of those things, to often the victims of disasters. And I think we really see that the remote villages in North Sumatra who are living there are the ones who are greatly affected. Whereas people such as the corporations, the people who are wealthy from illegal logging, they might not see any of the impact to their cities, their homes, even their livelihoods. So again, when we use words like natural disasters, like it was always going to happen, is kind of what a natural disaster implies. It distances those who are actually responsible for a lot of some of these events, and the Sumatra floods and landslides particularly. So the last element I really want to cover, not to belabor the 45 minutes that we've already covered, but I want to talk about framing of a disaster, and this is the national disaster status. And so as of December 15th, the president slash prime minister, I forget the title, I apologize, president of Indonesia, the president has noted that there will not be a declaration to make the Sumatra floods and landslides a national disaster. And when you actually Google like national disaster, Indonesia, floods, Sumatra, you find a bunch of information, and some of it is contradictory, leading me to believe that there's definitely different media sources trying to influence a lot of the message. So I'll provide what I have found, and I try to remain as objective as possible. But I'll also provide a little bit of what has the government done. What did the government say they did? The central Indonesian government. So, and before we get into that, let me quickly do a policy a policy overview of how disaster management works in Indonesia. Basically, the central government is located on Java, which is where Jakarta and a few other very large cities are in Indonesia. And Java is really where the central government hub is. National resources are located there. But because Indonesia is so widespread, it's really difficult to have a centralized approach. So the policies for disaster management in Indonesia are basically this. The province or the state deals with it first, and if they are overwhelmed, the national government will step in. It's very similar to how the US does a lot of their disaster management too. The state will run the disaster management first. If they are overwhelmed, they can request to the government, the federal government, and say, hey, we need help. That's what happens here. So Aceh, West Sumatra, North Sumatra all have their own government entities, their own basically governing bodies. And all three of them have said, hey, we are very overwhelmed. We need the national government's assistance. And if I could oversimplify, the national government has said, no, we do not believe that this is a national disaster or that it has overwhelmed your capacity to the extent where we need to step in. Why? Why? So, like, we've already talked about the impact. We've already talked about all that kind of stuff. So let's talk about, well, what has the national government done? And to be fair to them, this is what I've found and been able to confirm. From the first days of the central government, that's the national government's response, they have been there with the three provinces and they have mobilized significantly. Meaning they've established command posts, they've established staging areas where resources can actually be flown to and then distributed from. And the difficulty, again, of Sumatra is that it is an island itself. So the national government is saying, well, you guys are an island, and it takes a lot of resources, logistics, administration to be able to move resources to this island. But also, Sumatra is very mountainous. Lots of volcanoes. There's lots of tropical forests. Again, can't think of the tropical forest word. Amazon, but not in not in Brazil, here in Indonesia. Basically, it's really difficult to get resources to and from. So the national government has said, like, we have poured a lot of resources in, and we've also included search and rescue. But because there's so many landslides, a lot of villages are still isolated. We have to actually do that first. And that requires machinery. And it takes months to get through a lot of landslides. Not only that, there's been more than 50,000 personnel from the National Defense Forces, the National Police, and then the National Search and Rescue, and other volunteers who have deployed from these affected areas. The national government has coordinated that. But the other component of this is the national government has also funded a large amount of money, which has gone directly to the mayors of cities and the 3 different provinces, states. So basically, the national government has said, we are doing everything we can to provide direct assistance, but there's, and the regents, the mayors have received immediate cash, they received money, so now they have to do what they have to do before we can, fully take over. And additionally, the national government has said that, and confirmed, that they have already started building temporary shelters, building some permanent infrastructure and housing, and building facilities. And their currency is something I'm blanking on, but they've allocated 60 trillion, which is millions and millions of dollars. So again, to that point, as of the 19th, the national government has done something. Those 4 points I have been able to confirm through multiple sources, which were biased and not biased. So, national government is doing something, but the people and the states believe that it should be a national disaster or declared as one. What does having that declaration do? Well, first of all, it allows more government resources, central government resources, national government resources, to go to Aceh, West Sumatra, North Sumatra. It also allows not only those resources, but funds as well. You have way more access to any sort of money to rebuild the infrastructure and whatnot. It also allows the access to more, I guess you could say, like, logistical support. And it also acknowledges that the Sumatra governments are overwhelmed, and that now the national government has to step in, and that the national government should also ask for assistance from international partners or from other countries, is basically that. And these are things that have not happened. And again, so in previous national declared disasters, we've seen basically like Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, other countries basically step up and say, here is resources, here's money, here's food, and we're going to ship them to you, and we're going to give them to you. Whereas the president of Indonesia on the 15th of December has actually said in several press conferences now that he has been contacted by several foreign leaders offering to send aid to Indonesia. But he said specifically, I told them, thank you for your concern, but we are capable. Indonesia can handle this. So there has been no request for international assistance, despite a lot of the disaster really overwhelming the local capacity. Additionally, there's also been the step of, well, there's not enough assistance from the national government as of now to help out the local governments. So the local governments are basically requesting this, that they declared a national disaster, that more resources come from the national Indonesian government, and that you ask for assistance from other countries as well. So much so that there has actually been a protest or an ongoing protest during the recovery for this. And we will get back to further reasons why there is no national disaster status in just one moment. But I want to cover this protest first, and then we'll get to it. But basically, people are starting to put white flags near their house or where they're rebuilding. And it's really interesting. There's a few articles that have covered this. I don't know the significance or historical meaning of a white flag, but the white flag is now an indication of a protest that is basically asking for the national government to do more. And this protest has grown. Not only is it in Aceh, West Sumatra, North Sumatra, but more and more publicity is growing over it. And so clearly they are succeeding in the optics of it, in the diffusing of the message, which is we need more support from the national government. We need more support to do search and rescue, to do cleanup. And what's really interesting is that now, as of December 10th, there was a coalition of people from Sumatra, from the information I've found, a coalition of 113 societies organized themselves who are demanding that the central government declare the floods and the landslides a national disaster. So 113 people, and they've sent now what is a subpoena, basically demanding that the national government do more or declare more. And back to the subpoena quickly. So the subpoena has come out, and it basically suggests that citizens have filed a lawsuit against 12 state officials for specifically West Sumatra, and it will certainly bleed into the other North Sumatra and Aceh as well. But the subpoena accuses the government of negligence, number one, in preventing and addressing ecological disasters, where they believe that linked to forest destruction, land clearing, and poor environmental management, i.e. the illegal logging, was the main reason why this disaster occurred. So when we dive into why wouldn't the national government want to declare this a national disaster, I think the answer becomes abundantly clear. Basically, the national government has really favored logging, economic exploitation, and the potential to get sort of benefits from that, and that by declaring it a national disaster, that could really expose a lot of the policies driving illegal logging. So basically, it's a one-for-one, that there's economic extraction over the potential for basically providing more resources. But then there's also a few other reasons. Number one, there's been reduction in budget as well. So the National Disaster Management Agency, their budget was 1.4 trillion, and now it is 500 billion. And that is quite a bit of a difference in terms of the amount of resources. So there's less resources for the National Disaster Management Agency to actually be able to work through things logistically, provide relief, and that has certainly led to delays. And so by opening up, quote unquote, the national disaster, the declaration, you grant more funds, which they probably don't want to fully invest in the sense of could also lead to, opening up the illegal logging component and kind of the corruption there. So there's certainly kind of a conflict of interest, economics, politics, that sort of stuff. But then also the rejecting of foreign aid, and I think this is more of like a optics sort of idea that if the national government asks for foreign aid, they might be perceived as weak, or they might be perceived as not being able to manage Aceh, West Sumatra, North Sumatra, and Sumatra as a whole. And there is a growing amount of articles now talking about the desire for parts of Sumatra to be their own country or their own, autonomous regions. So that certainly has a role to play. So by not declaring it as a national disaster, really the national government is just saying like, well, we can handle it. We don't need the assistance of anybody else. And they might be trying to kind of diminish the widespread nature of this event and also hide the fact that a lot of the permits might have been linked to government officials, as the subpoena suggests. So overall, again, we can kind of tie things back to no natural disasters, and mismanagement of resources of land use planning really played a large role into this. And I kind of wanted to end off with like an ecological / wildlife component to this event. And I wanted to talk about orangutans. So orangutans, particularly the Tapapaluni orangutan in Sumatra, there is only about, depending on where you look, 800 to 1,000 left in the world of these particular orangutans. I'm just going to call them orangutans for the rest of the segment. But unfortunately, a number of ecologists have already went out and found that 33 to 54 of the orangutans have been killed after the floods and the landslides, and they are located in just North Sumatra. But the difficulty is that the 800 to 1,000 before the 33 to 54 perished was that they were actually threatened by, well, illegal logging, yeah, of course, by mining, and by increasing palm oil plantations, which is a secondary element to probably a lot of the things that have happened. Again, the development of extracting resources and reducing the ecosystems. And then also large hydropower plants and projects. So again, their destruction, the ecosystem's destruction, is a large result of what people have done. Mining, power plants, hydropower plants, dams, and palm oil production, and then illegal logging. And that has really threatened a lot of the orangutans' existence and their habitability and their habitat. So they are one of the world's rarest great apes, and they are disproportionately affected as well. And I think that kind of recaps the theme of the Sumatra floods and landslides so perfectly, is that the most disproportionately affected are often the ones who are not contributing to the mining, the palm oil plantations, the large hydroelectric power dams and projects, and the corruption of illegal logging and not declaring a national disaster and whatnot. But they're often the ones who are the most affected. They might have the least amount of say. And in that somewhat alarming / I guess like very sad note, I want to just quickly recap. This is, for me, a milestone event around the world. Not only does it have this climate change element of we have fundamentally altered the climate, it is quote-unquote weirder, harder to predict, as Dr. Catherine Hayhoe would say. So we don't know what's coming. We have no idea the implications and further implications of how our weather systems and how the storms and those other phenomena are occurring or how they're going to occur. But additionally, we have driven a lot of the damages for this event. The limited access to relief, the reduction of budget for an agency to actually do some sort of relief. They don't have as much money, so they can't. Not declaring it a national disaster, meaning that there's just limited resources in general. And then the illegal logging. And there's probably more on palm oil plantations and palm oil itself, but I wasn't able to find the direct correlation. And then our development in places that were once just natural habitats for water to run off. All of these factors point to, again, the No Natural Disasters campaign. And if you're interested, there is a website, and it really talks about that when we use the word natural disaster, it really frames disasters as these things that are were always going to happen. But this event, I think, highlights that perfectly, that it wasn't always going to happen like this. And perhaps there might have been 14 to 12 feet of water, but if there was no logs or deforestation, would it have been as widespread? Probably not, no. And with that, that is all I got for today. If you have any disasters you want covered, any questions, anything you want answered, feel free to email me at catastrophepodcast@gmail.com. I'm also openly accessible at the TikTok, social media, and LinkedIn. And I hope you were able to learn quite a bit about this disaster and the implications for just the future of our world, because I think it's really profound. And with that, that is all I got for today. Thank you for sticking along with me for the entire episode, a longer one, and I thank you. I will be covering the Turkish sinkholes next, and kind of the phenomena of water management and water practices and how that plays a role. With that, thank you for joining.